Good afternoon. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the philosophy department here at Providence College and the director of the Humanities Forum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this week's forum. The Humanities Forum is an initiative of the Providence College Humanities program. It's a regular space most Friday afternoons during the semester when the campus community come together to reflect on some of the central themes in the humanities. At least once a semester, we host a musical performance and discussion, and it's really our honor and pleasure this week to welcome the Bohemian Quartet to Providence College's campus. Musical performances for the forum are also always joined to a discussion of the cultural context of the music, and I'm pleased now to introduce Professor Jennifer Illuzzi, an associate professor of history here at Providence College, who is our co-host this afternoon with Professor Stan Renard and the Bohemian Quartet. Having received her PhD in history from the University of Minnesota in 2008, Dr. Illuzzi has been a member of the history department here since 2011. She teaches regularly in the DWC program, as well as courses in modern European history and global feminism. A devoted member of the Providence College community, she was the inaugural recipient of the Providence College Faculty Service Award for exceptional service to PC in 2017. She's a specialist in the Romani, also known as the Romo or Gypsies. Her book, Gypsies in Germany and Italy, 1861 to 1914, Lives Outside the Law, was published in 2014. And she's lectured widely on this topic, including an appearance on NPR's All Things Considered. And I might add, I just learned she's working at the moment on the relationship between the Romani and the Catholic Church in Italy. We are delighted to have her with us for today's forum. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Jennifer Illuzzi.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. So I titled my talk today, The Romani People, A People of Europe and Their Stories, and I borrow this, A People of Europe, from, I was going to set my timer so I don't talk too long. Because I take the term from Sir Angus Fraser, who wrote a history called The Gypsies, which is a very good history, but one of the things I like most about the book is that the main argument is that the Romani are a people of Europe. They're not often thought about that way, and they're not often considered to be, but they are, in fact, a people of Europe, an ethnic group that has been in Europe for a very long time. So who are the Romani people? As I said, it's an ethnic group. They arrived in Europe somewhere around the late Middle Ages to the early Renaissance period, and they remain, of course, a people of Europe today. I have here on the slide a sketch. This sketch was done by Leonardo da Vinci in 1493, and it's entitled Man Tricked by Gypsies. And this gives you a sense of a long-standing prejudice and history of persecution of the Romani people upon their arrival, really soon after their arrival in Europe. And so you see here the fine upstanding Roman citizen surrounded by gypsies who are bilking him out of his money or doing some sort of trick against him. And so one of the things that I have found most striking in my research is there's such a divide between perceptions of who gypsies are and the actual lived experience of the Romani people. And personally, in my own work, when I was defending my dissertation, I had one member of the committee come into my dissertation defense and tell me how gypsies stole his wallet while he was in Italy, which is kind of unwelcome. He had just read my book. I'm like, really? But this really differs from the experience I've had with Romani people in my life. People I've met, women's studies professors, musicologists, musicians, sanitation workers, linguists, anthropologists, right? So Romani people are a very diverse group, and there is a huge gap between this perception and the lived reality. The Romani people are a diaspora people. And diaspora people have, there's advantages and disadvantages to being diasporic. It's difficult to maintain cultural traditions in a diasporic community, and as you can see from this map, the Romani people are located in every country in Europe. The larger wagon wheels mean more people. The wagon wheel, by the way, is on the Romani flag. It is a symbol of the people of the ethnic group. So that's why that's used here to depict the numbers of Romani throughout Europe. But the advantage of the diasporic people is they have this rich and diverse fabric of their cultural life, and we'll look at one aspect of that today. The Romani people are divided into several large subgroups. One of them is Sinti. Those are mainly located in northern Italy, also in Germany. The Manouche, who are located in France. The Rome people that are in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Kale, which are also Central and Eastern European. And even within those major subgroups, there are smaller groups that are divided by professions, historical professions, horse traders, or basket makers, or steel or metal workers. So there's a lot of different groups under this one umbrella of Romani. So the Romani people, as I already alluded to, have a difficult story and a difficult history. I took this photograph in Rome, Italy, in 2008, and it says, "No gypsies, no Rome camps." And that continues even today, that kind of prejudice. Just when I was doing research this summer in Italy, there was 2 cases in the news, one of a Romani girl who was shot by a white nationalist, and another case of a camping ground in which many Romani families had lived for several, I think it was 20 years, and the government came in and shut it down with no warning, and even against the European Court of Human Rights, who had ordered a stay on the closure of the camp. It was closed anyway, and people were left on the street with no alternate plan for housing. So this is a difficult story and a difficult history. So I have a short amount of time. So I'm only going to give you a little teeny bit of that history, and I'm going to span the 20th century with the story of one large family of Rome horse traders who have their origins in the Italian borderland of Friuli, which is a place in Italy that rotated between Austrian rule and Italian rule. It becomes Italian after the First World War, and so this family kind of moved in between Austrian and Italian citizenship and state borders, but it's the highlighted area on this map up here. Sorry if it's not very clear. So the Lavakovich family. So the 4 of them that are the focus, I found this file in the Rome archive, and the Rome authorities, they start collecting data on this family in 1908. This is Maria, Ursula, Leopoldo, and Michele. These are their mugshots, so they were not having their best day, obviously, from their mugshots, but these photographs were included in the file. And so they were mostly horse traders, and again, from Friuli. And there's another Lavakovich I'm going to include in this story, whose name is Giuseppe Lavakovich. He published an autobiography in 1976, and I'm going to tell part of his story. The relationship between the groups is not quite known, but again, they're from the same region, they practice the same profession. Chances are there was some relationship between these families. So on March 29th, 1908, in the province of Treviso, the police arrested members of this family, including these 4 you see here. They were arrested for measures of public security because they were without means of sustenance. This is a rather arbitrary law that was often used to persecute unwanted groups, right? So if you were walking around with no money in your pockets, you would probably only be arrested for that crime if someone suspected that you might be a gypsy. Michele was described as having brown skin, and under his profession he was listed as a gypsy, a zingaro. And his marital status was listed as living with Lavakovich Maria. When he was asked of his origins, Michele stated, "I cannot say anything about the location of my origins. I do not remember knowing my parents, who have been dead for many years, and I do not know where they died. I know that my father's name was Giovanni. I do not know my mother's name. I believe that I was born in Italy, and more precisely in the Veneto, but I cannot say precisely in which town or province, since I am not registered in any civil registry. I was always told that I had come into the world on the road with others, under the trees, as generally all the gypsies do. However, I cannot exclude that I was born abroad. On my account, I can declare that I have never been abroad and that I have always remained in the Veneto, traveling around the provinces of Vicenza, Udine, Belluno, and especially in the mountains of Cadore and Bellinzona. I live in marriage with the gypsy Maria Levakovic, and I do not remember where I met her. From our union, 5 children were born, here and there, but always in the Veneto, and they were not registered in any civil registry. So, of course, you can see here a narrative of resistance of Michele Levakovic in 1908. He clearly does not want the person who is interrogating him to know where he came from or who he is. And this is a strategy used by Romani families early in the 20th century because, right, they're trying to navigate, right, to prevent himself from getting expelled to Austria-Hungary. The interrogator responded to Michele by saying, "Your pronunciation has nothing to do with the Italian language or with the Venetian dialect, and he must be Austro-Hungarian, so he should have to leave." The police detained the family in Conegliano for a month and proposed their expulsion as foreigners. They need this month to do research on the background of the family in order to determine if they can send them back to Austria-Hungary. At the end of the month, there's a letter in the file from Michele asking the police to please bring his children to the jail because they can no longer live outside by themselves. So for this whole time, they're living without their parents who are both in jail. It's unclear if they were being taken care of by a neighbor or a friend, but the children became unable to support themselves. So the family's geographical origins posed a tricky problem for Italian authorities, since they were known in the region and by locals, but had no documents and didn't register their births. So this offered some kind of protection for them because it became very difficult to expel them through official channels back to Austria. But it also placed the family in this category of stateless people. This illustrated the difficulty of the Romani people themselves at this time. They often refused to identify themselves to make it difficult for the police, but that often allowed authorities to strip them of any claims to nationality, which left them outside of the protections of the law. So as I mentioned before, Giuseppe Levakovic also grew up, was born early in the 20th century, like Michele, who we just heard from, and he published an autobiography in 1976. So this is a little excerpt from that biography of his life. And again, I want you to focus here on the difference between his lived experience and the police persecution story that we just heard. So he's writing about his childhood. "My father carried the tents on his shoulders, and my mother carried pots and pans for cooking, and I, who was a small child, had to take care of the guard dog, because in those places there were many wolves. Around sunset, my father would stop in a good spot for camping, a little elevated, so that there wouldn't be a danger of flooding, protected from the wind, and not far from a water source, and always close to a village, so that we could buy food. My father or my mother, according to the circumstances, put up the tents, assisted by the children. The fire was lit with wood we found in the area, and we prepared to eat. We ate dinner at sunset." When we had these little parties, he's talking about festivities, my father would invite his friends, either Rome or Gaggi, and Gaggi is the Romani term for non-Romani people. Either Rome or Gaggi, and everyone ate sitting on the ground around the fire. Sometimes someone brought an instrument, a harmonica or a guitar, and then we sang in the Romani language or the language of the Gaggi. The next morning at dawn, we departed. My father was very much liked by the Gaggi and by the authorities because he was an honest person and a hard worker. My family did not speak Italian, but our language and the 3 languages of those locales, Croatian, Slovene, and Serb. My sister helped her mother with the chores and with preparing food. When we arrived at the new workplace at the end of our travels, generally close to a sawmill, my father rented a stall or a lean-to from the local farmers, because in those places it might snow up to a meter, and one just couldn't stay in a tent. My father worked driving carts or sleds with a pair of horses to transport the trunks of trees. He was a very prized worker because he understood the horses. It wasn't enough to own them, but instead to really understand them. In fact, the Rome have always had this special ability and a love for horses, and for this reason, they tend to get along very well. So you see here a tension between police persecution of a Lovakovich family that is prosperous and does have experience and money from trading in horses, and the story of Giuseppe's childhood, which is relatively kind of a nice story of childhood. And it also points to another interesting difference that I've been thinking a lot about, that many of these Romani families had relationships with local farmers. And they came to the same farmers every year, and they got hay and they got wood in return for labor, and they would form friendships. And this was very different from the relationship that they had with the local authorities and with the police. And so there's really a tension there. So this relatively idyllic picture changes, particularly in Italy, by 1910. There's a cholera outbreak in Italy in 1910. It's focused in the south of Italy, near Bari, and it is linked to the arrival of a group of gypsies, supposedly. Of course, we know now that cholera is not spread that way. It's not person-to-person contact. It's bad sanitation. But at the time, it was blamed on the arrival of the gypsies. So you see here that chart was in the archive, and it sort of says the date of the arrival of the gypsies, and then the spike in the number of cholera cases. Therefore, it must be the gypsies. That's the headline from the Stampa about the cholera epidemic. So at the time of this cholera epidemic, the Italian state decides, rather than just sort of informal persecution of gypsy families, they're going to expel them all from Italy. So the Lovakoviches, in their previous arrests, had been arrested, detained, as we saw with the Lovakoviches, and eventually released, usually, because they couldn't prove their citizenship, and they usually couldn't prove the crime they had arrested them on. So they were usually just released, eventually, went back, did their thing. But in 1910, that changes. In 1910, they're expelled. So 2 years after the 1908 incident I told you about, in 1910, Leopoldo and Michele were arrested in Treviso in the Veneto, and they were scheduled for expulsion. And so the gypsies were supposed to make their own way over the Austrian border at this point. And so what ends up happening, basically, because I don't want to take too much time, is the family gets arrested, they're expelled to Austria. There's a problem, because they get to Austria, and they have to board a steamship to cross the lake. And the steamships are no longer letting people they label as gypsies on. Because what's been happening is the people get on, Austria says they're not getting off here. They come back to Italy, and Italy says they're not getting off here. And they end up with people living on a steamship. So the steamship companies are like, we're not taking people that we think are gypsies anymore. So the Italian state and the Austrians keep shoving the people back that the Italians are trying to send back over this border back and forth. So the Italian government comes up with a solution, which is to send people to Brazil, which has very open immigration policies, and so they stick them on a boat from Genoa, and they're shipped off to Brazil. So the Lovakoviches are sent to Brazil twice, and both times they come right back to Italy. Now that's not uncommon, because there was a whole group of Italian workers called golondrinas, named after birds basically, who would go and work in Argentina and then come back, so seasonal workers. But the Lovakoviches kept coming back. Their home was in Italy. That's where their business was, so they kept coming back. By 1912, Michele is again arrested. And he is arrested for aggravated begging. He's destitute, and he's begging. So what had been a relatively prosperous family of horse traders, by 1912, they don't have anything anymore, the family, because they've spent all their money going back and forth to Brazil, which is not something they really intended to do. And so Michele claims that he's an Austrian resident, and they send him back to Austria once again. At this point, so Michele had previously fought hard to sort of say, I'm an Italian citizen, but at this point he just says, I'm Austrian, he's destitute, and he goes back. World War I brought further difficulties for the Lavakovich family. Their travel routes were limited because of the border controls during the war. There was a brief easing of these problems after World War I, but then, of course, there's the rise of fascism in both Italy and Germany, which leads to more problems for the Lavakoviches. Interestingly, Giuseppe Lavakovich, whose story I read a little bit from, he actually volunteers to go build railroads for Mussolini in Abyssinia, Ethiopia. He does so successfully, and he gains his Italian citizenship by doing this, and he comes back an Italian citizen. Meanwhile, his family was interned in Mussolini's internment camps for Roma and Sinti. And many people died in those camps. Several members of his family died. They did not get their Italian citizenship. So it was he comes back to this shock of what had happened to his family. So this is another piece of the story from an Alberto Lavakovich, and this was published in 1972. And he tells his story of being deported during World War II. I was a small child of 3 in 1943 in Dachau in Germany. I was in that extermination camp at a very tender age, and I saw hundreds of human beings die, most of them Sinti and Jews. They died of hunger, and that little bit of black bread that they gave us was given with evil intent. And I saw my sister tossed heartlessly onto a wagon and thrown in the crematorium on the orders of the Führer, in front of our eyes and those of our dear mother, who tried to hold her back, but they ripped her away, and only her hair remained in her hands. And I have a painting here done by Chaya Stoika, who was an Austrian Romani Holocaust survivor. And she died in 2013. And when she was in her 50s, she began doing these paintings to sort of document her memories of Auschwitz all those years later. So under the fascist regime in Italy, and of course under the Nazis in Germany, many Romani people were interned and killed during the war, including members of the Lavakovich family. So to sum it all up, the Lavakoviches, I think, tell, and I know it's a geographically limited story, but they tell a little piece of some of the 20th century history of the Romani people. And for me, they tell a story of resilience, of flexibility, and of survival in the face of a culture and a society that often has the aim of getting rid of them. And so it's quite a remarkable story of this family. I think it also gives a sense of the idea that I started with, that Romanis are people of Europe. They belong there as much as anyone else, despite popular perception that they don't. And there's also a bit of a story here of maintaining cultural distinctiveness through art, poetry, music, language, and dress. And we're going to hear a little bit more of that happier story from my co-host today, Stan Renard and the Bohemian Quartet. And so, yeah, it'll get happier now, hopefully. So we're very lucky today to have with us the Bohemian Quartet, the acclaimed Providence, Rhode Island based ensemble featuring a violin, a viola, cello, and bass, specializes in the music of the Romani or Gypsy tradition, along with related Eastern European folk styles. The Bohemian Quartet was founded in 2005. Violinist Stan Renard, a composer and virtuoso player, assembled the group with the idea of preserving the tradition and indulging in the virtuosic playing of classic gypsy music. Renard recruited like-minded friends, Dave Zinno on upright bass, Christine Harrington on cello, and Nancy Richardson on viola. I had the pleasure of taking in a performance of the quartet last spring when they performed with the Bristol Community String Project, which Stan had a hand in forming while he was here in Rhode Island. Stan is going to give you a little bit of the history behind Romani music tradition, and he studied violin performance in Moscow, London, and Boston. He's also an alumnus of the Pierre Monteau Conducting School in Hancock, Maine. As a conductor, Stan studied with and was the assistant of maestros Lanfranco Marcelletti, sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, Harvey Solberger, and Michael Jinbo. Stan Renard holds a master in music from the Conservatory of Versailles, France, in chamber music, a master in music from UMass Amherst in violin and viola performance, an MBA from right here, go Friars, Providence College, and a PhD in international business from Southern New Hampshire University, and a DMA in violin performance from the University of Connecticut. Dr. Renard served as the conductor of the Colby Symphony Orchestra and the Violin and Viola Applied Music Associate at Colby College. Currently, Dr. Renard is Assistant Professor of Music Marketing at the University of Texas in San Antonio, Texas. So before I say that, sorry. If anyone has questions for me, I can take one or two now, or we can just hold off and wait until the reception. But otherwise, we were planning on having Stan talk to you a little bit and play some music. But if anyone has a quick question or two, I'd be happy to answer. Yes?
Many groups of determined discrimination and oppression tend to succumb to the lure of secular market culture. How are the gypsies doing?
I think in many ways there is a concerted effort to maintain Romani values and Romani culture in the face of losing that identity. But I think like in any community, it's a struggle between those who are integrated, right, and who are professors of music, professor of whatever, right, that there's always a pressure for all of us to sort of conform. But I think there is a very concerted nationalist movement that's emerged, especially since the 1970s, among the Romani people to kind of maintain a cultural identity and a cultural distinctiveness.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So you described the Romani as a diaspora. Is there a place from the diaspora in which?
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of debate about that, but we know that the Romani people originated in India and began migrating northward and westward, really starting around, best estimates 900 to 1000 AD, CE, I guess I should say. And we know this because their language is Indic, right? We know that the language roots are from India. But there's different theories about which group migrated out of India and which caste they were related to. There's a whole debate about that. Okay, so I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Renard and the Bohemian Quartet to you today, and please join me in thanking them immensely for being here.
Oh, can you hear me?
Sorry. You come with music.
All right, great, awesome, thank you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Megan, so much for inviting us to be part of this forum. It's very special. I remember being a student here in 2005, 2006. So the college has changed quite a bit since. It's new buildings, it's exciting. You know, so lots of beautiful things happening. I run this group which I started in 2005, the Bohemian Quartet, and it had different instruments over the years. And this is like the current ensemble, and we've been playing together since about, I don't know, like maybe 2009 or whatever. Yeah, Dave joined this a little bit later. And my experience with this music, I grew up in southern France. And my father is Parisian from France, and my mother is Polish from what used to be Poland, but now is Ukraine, Lviv. So during the Second World War, you know, Poland, most of Ukraine used to be Poland. Poland was the largest country, but after the Second World War, moved towards Germany, the whole Ukrainian part was gone, and but I did a lot of traveling, and I spent a lot of my childhood listening to this music and spending time in different camps and different tribes. And as a child, I had the opportunity to join this couple of very musical, families, both in Poland, Germany, and France. And that's where I learned a lot of these things. But anyway, let me start a little bit about what is Romani music. It's more music genres and so forth. And let's get started here real quick. Okay, and I think I'm going to start with one particular question that I get all the time. Folks tell me, this music sounds like klezmer music. I'm like, well, you're not totally wrong. You know, it's very similar. On the left-hand side, you have a picture of the klezmer band, and on the right-hand side, you have a typical Romani ensemble. And by the way, I don't know if you mentioned the term where the term gypsy comes from. It's a misconception by the Europeans who thought that the gypsies were Egyptians who came from Egypt. Thus, gypsies, they didn't understand. So we don't use the term gypsy because of the, at least I don't use it because of the negative connotations that it carries besides. This is the term that we use. There is no written language for Romanians. There's no such thing as a written language. They have, we don't agree on the spells of words. There's 50 different dialects. They don't understand each other. And so it's a very rich tradition, but it's an oral tradition. Music is taught orally. It's been taught orally all over the world until maybe like the late 19th century, early 20th century. But before that, everyone learned music by ear, and it was very common. I wrote the music down just because we have to consider it. So we'll share that with you later. But anyway, the klezmer musicians, the klezmerians, and the Romani have a common origin. They play very similar tunes, usually sirbas, choras, doinas, that's the type of dances. We always dance it for celebration. We have a function in society. Every single piece has a function in society. It's not just one thing. We are attending for celebrating weddings, for funerals, or for a lot of lives, children to sleep and so forth. But anyway, okay. So this is a klezmer tune. She'll show you a Romani. Understandable that some folks think it's the same genre of music, right? I can play similar instruments. What kind of instruments do you see? So, violins, fiddles. What was that instrument? Playing violins.
What was that instrument?
It's a hand dulcimer. It's called a cymbal. So, and there is such an instrument in almost every European country, as well as Appalachian, folk music uses. Dulcimer is a chromatic. There's two different kinds, the klezmer musician also use cymbals, they call it. So they have different terms, but they're really in essence the same thing. And next one. All right. So the area where most Romani and klezmer musicians learn this musical heritage is this part of Romania. Now, sometimes the term Romani sounds like Romanian, and it's confusing to some degree. And perhaps like the largest concentration of professional musicians who play the music that you're about to hear in a little bit are in Romania. And there is one particular village called Clejan, it's spelled C-L-A-J-A-N-I, and 99% of the people who live in that village are professional musicians. And mostly what they do, they play waves. That's what they do. Everybody's a pro. And then that particular short video that you heard, that's that image. Among my very well-known Romani creative people, Charlie Chaplin was a Roman. George Stupra, the classical pianist, very famous, was a Roman. And so forth. It's a very long list. Anyway, okay, so the origin of the Romani people go back to the Punjab region of India, which is what we know today as Rajasthan. And so the first tune that we're going to play today for you, I figured, usually I do stuff very differently. I do the whole talk and then we play. But I decided to do things and kind of follow the diffusion of the diaspora and play the tunes as they are aligned with the different countries and what we call the Romani drum, the gypsy drum. Okay, so this is a tune that's called Kayan Raga. And a raga is very, in some sense, an improvised melody. And this is what we're going to play for you. This is a tune that I got from a fellow who played the hammer listener in India. And so it's a Roman musician from the Punjab region. And the name of that particular hammer listener is the Santu. And so I tried to create an arrangement for this group, even though we play both string instrument, to imitate a percussive instrument playing this right. screwdriver with a beat square? Was it 2 and 3? Or was it 7? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. That's what we call added value. And that is one of the main distinctions between klezmer music and Romani music. Klezmer musicians never use that, ever. You'll never find a tune in klezmer rap that has a 7, a 6, 11, 16, or one of those type of meters. So meter, we don't always know first. And it's really the kind of structure of everything we do. So this next tune that we're going to play is also from that same part of the world. It's called Horo, and you have the Horo is a different dance from the Hora. The Hora is a Romanian dance that you also find in Israel. And so, of course, the Hora in Israel belongs to the Klezmer, and the one that is in Romania and that we tend to play is the Hora that is played by Romani musicians. It is still a circular dance, very much so, but it's a different approach. So this is a Bulgarian Hora with a slow introduction. Improvised fashion with a lot of the types of harmonies that you would hear back in the day. So those are tunes that are not factory music. But as I was mentioning, it comes very much from a Turkish heritage in terms of pitch. So here we're going to play a tune called John Barrett, And that's a Romanian folk tune, but, you know, the Turks invaded Europe for a very long time, went all the way to Vienna, and this is like the heritage of the God with them. So this is very much a Turkish tune, even though it was performed in Romanian folk, Romanian folk rap for a very long time. So we're just going to play the jump right now. And so a lot of this has to be danced in a circle. You can't, just like in rock or swing or foxtrot or whatever, or valse, there's no such steps. It has always, there's something also so popping. You see me popping around too. Anyway. Then a lot of the repertoire that is known for is virtuosity and, that is somehow the crossroad between classical music, virtuoso stuff, and Hungarian folk rock is this whole repertoire of Romani tunes from Hungary. So we're going to start with a slow tune called the Heralded. And we get to actually instruments enter layers, so which creates like a little bit of a nice, sonic effect. is around the same time when this music was appearing, there was a ban by the emperor who declared that it was illegal for classical musicians, the one that he was going to employ in his court to play valses and play all sorts of like fancy gigs, that he did then. And so what happened, he put a decree on, trees and different like pubs and so forth, Cholera, but the Romans kept playing folk repertoire. So classical musicians were not allowed to play folk music, right? They could not play fiddle tunes, that's what it is. Fiddle tunes. No classical musician was allowed. And they're different, so they could read the decree. Romani musicians could not. So they ignored it. And of course, they did not play in the court, they played in church, in the taverns, in the bars. And they maintained this repertoire. Thanks to them, this still exists. Otherwise, none of this folk music in Hungarian, area will exist because it was all orally transmitted. So one generation of musicians stops playing it, it is gone. Right? Remember, the first ethnomusicologists that were recording folk music was Bartok and Kodály, who were two Hungarian and Romanian ethnomusicologists. They didn't start doing this until like the 1930s. So, music for like 300 years before that would have disappeared if the Romans were not there to preserve it in some kind of way. But at the same time, I need to mention this, just like when you say a joke, and someone tells you a joke, and you tell someone else that same joke, you're going to say it differently, you're going to change it a little bit. The delivery is going to be a little bit different. It was the same thing with the music. So what started as very, perhaps, I don't want to use the word plain, but plain folk music became very elaborate, with lots of ornaments and speeds and all sorts of virtuoso things to entertain people who were dreaming a little too much. Okay? I hope that makes some sense now. So, we're going to play a tune called Tribal Dances. If I can find it. Let's see. The tribal dances are Romanian suite. It's got some very basic rhythm in 4, very straightforward. It's easy to find the pattern, and then obviously jumps into that 7/8 pattern that we already seen a few times today. Tribal dances. 1. So let's move us along a little bit here. And, okay, let me pause this for a second. So, as I mentioned, 50 different dialects. Is there a common usage? A common usage? Well, perhaps not using the language, like particular language, because then it would be 50 different languages. It doesn't really work very well to do songs in 50 different languages. But they're kind of like rockers of their own day, and so they did a lot of scatting. And you'll see we play here what we call braccia, which is a viola with a flat bridge and only 3 strings that are played at the same time, all the time. And that gives you kind of like, let's say, the beats, and then you'll have like, similar to the Cajun tradition of Louisiana, they use spoons and different techniques, and you'll see, some of the tap dancing that they do, and then scat. So none of what they sing make it, it's just random syllables. They're not words. Okay? So let's hear it. Awesome. So, a very different style of music. This is perhaps like the most common genre you can hear. This is an ensemble from Slovakia. And some of these excerpts that I have here come from a movie that was produced by a Romani film producer whose name is Dykey. And this is called Lacho, and it means the gypsy girl. Lacho being spelled Latcho, and drums are Lacho. So this is, how can you recognize in Romani music? We already figured out, okay, the rhythm is part of the equation. The instruments are very similar to Klezmer instruments. And then perhaps we'll need to look a little bit at the structure. So you don't need to know anything about music to appreciate it, so I'll illustrate it for you. So on one hand side, you have scales that belong to Klezmer music. On the right hand side, those are the makams, meaning the Turkish scales that are most commonly used in the tunes that you heard today. And so the Hijaz makam, that is one of the typical ones. You see little bars over some of the signs in front of notes. That is the microtone. Those are the notes in between the keys of your piano. So it will be instead, that would be like in equal temperament. If I play Mozart, it would be but yes, it's very different, and that's what creates perhaps Middle Eastern flavor in the music. On the left-hand side, if I play, say, that last scale there, very similar to church mode, but so Fiddler in the Roof, of course, is not, let's say, clean folk music, but the composer certainly used these particular modes to come up with melodies that sounded Klezmer. Okay? But it's very different from hearing something like this. And hear something like that. Right? It's not the same thing. Right? Different colors. Alright. Enough. Let's do some playing. Let's see. What am I doing here? Oh, cool. Perfect. So, So a couple of other clues. Oh, sorry. So in Klezmer music, we typically use like 2/4, 3/4, meters. In Romani music, we use like a lot of these mixed meters and compound meters that are very different as ratios of numbers. And then the performance practice is what is heard but not seen. So for instance, what I write on the page here and what I play is not the same. I add a lot of things, I subtract things. Every time I play, I do a completely new number of truths. Like if I say the same joke twice, I'm not going to say exactly the same. It might make you laugh one time, and the other time, my delivery might not be just quite this. Do you know what I mean? So that's what performance practice means. And an example of performance practice in Romani music will be like effects such as like this kind of whistling sound or left hand hits. Things like that you sometimes need to add, effects and so forth. And the tune that we're going to play next has plenty of those. I think what is essential for me is the function of music. A lot of the time we forget that music, especially folk music, had a function in society. So if you think about, perhaps the roots of jazz, picking a cotton in the south and then build a rhythm in order to maintain a work habit. It was very much the same thing in different aspects of, folks who sang songs to work. So folks who play music for weddings, funerals, and so forth. Okay, so it had a function. Recruiting soldiers in the army. So all sorts of roles in society. It was not just one thing. And I think that's my point here. Lots of variable tempies in this style of music. It's very unlike classical music, where the tempo is set and you play through the tune in one particular speed, unless it's a different movement. But in this case, we rush all the time. And rushing is part of that performance practice that we're talking about. In terms of learning this music, some folks have been breaking and learning. The experience I had was a multi-generational experience. It started within families, and usually it's not taught outside of the families, right? Because it's an oral tradition, it's kept secret in some way. But because, a lot of this tradition is fading now, there's a little bit more ways of learning. But it's a multi-generational, learning technique. You learn from the older, more advanced and more experienced musician. So usually the eldest in the group is known as the lauta. And lauta in Romanian means lute. Because back then, the lute player was the name. But nowadays, lautare means this. Okay, they didn't change the name, but it means basically led from the violin. Very similar to what was done with cantatas with Bach in church, and then the violinist was the orchestra that was before conductors. So kind of like that, but more on the folk level. So I guess that's what I have. So these are all the genres of music that somehow, are connected to Romani musicians and Romani music. So, with this in mind, we're going to play a Machuzi Hora by Dykey. Grigorash Dykey, you can find recordings of him. He passed away, I think, in the 50s, and recorded a couple of very beautiful recordings. The American violinist, classical violinist, Yasha Eifert, thought he was the greatest violinist he ever met. So, Grigorash Dykey wrote a lot of music, again, in here, but a lot of it is preserved thanks to, recording technology, because he lived in the first part of the 20th century and that was it. So, there we go. So this is a hora very much like what the Let's Marine hora is like in Israel, but this one is a Romani hora. English stuff. No? Answer no? Any other questions? Did you enjoy it? Yes. Yes.
I want you to say again that thing you said about the root person.
Okay.
Person is
Right. So the leader of the band.
Yeah.
So in essence, when you play this kind of music, you need to set up the speed. You need to set up the tempo. So did you notice a lot of the time I was starting by myself? So that particular person in that role sets up the speed, sets up the tempo, decides how much we're going to rush, and when we're going to drop back. They all depend on the mood of how much coffee you have. And so that person was called the lautar. And lautar in Romanian, not in Romanian language, means lute, like the lute, like a mandolin, like Persian, Turkish lute. It comes from that era because that's where those instruments came from. It came from Persia, which is Iran today. But eventually, with the violin being invented in the 1600s, the violin took over because it had more sound, it had other properties that allowed it to lead the group perhaps more effectively than the lute. And the lute, honestly, fell out of favor. The guitar was invented at that time, so the guitar took over the mandolin and the lute and so forth. It was a more powerful instrument, and it's typically used in those groups. The hammer singer was there to do it up, the bass was there and so forth. So the lautari is the leader of the band. And usually the band is what we call the taraf. Taraf means band in Romanian. And does that?
Is there a certain prestige connected to being that person?
Usually it's the most experienced person in the style. So usually the person who first leads the group together, so there's business involved. So usually that's the person that decides to do it. Because it was with families, just like, cooks have apprentices and so forth. So, you're an apprentice to cook for a while, and then maybe the head chef says, all right, you're ready, you can open your own restaurant. So it was kind of the same idea. You were leading the band, and your dad or your grandfather told you, okay, you're ready to have your own band. I'll give you, the right to start, or something like that. So I think it was very much based on that.
There was a man.
But not necessarily. There was a very famous, one very famous woman, Romani violinist. The name is. They'll come back. By the time we talk later, they'll be back. They'll be back. And then there was a couple of famous singers that were leaders of the days. One of them is very active right now in Serbia. Has a very famous band. If you've seen the movie Borat, the soundtrack to Borat is by that band. Maybe not the greatest, but it's a lot of the music that is played in it is Romani music. And apart of, even like the beat machine type music that's in it, it's called turbo folk. So it is folk, but it's turbo because we got machines and beat machines and so forth, but it's still acoustic music, instruments playing a million miles an hour on top of that machine, and it creates that special music. It's still very popular over there. It's not something